What's going on, guys and gals? My name is Ben Kirsch from backbaydrumming.com, and today I'm going to be doing a very different video from what I normally do. So today we're going to be looking at 7 different microphones as drum overheads. Every microphone that we're going to be looking at is going to be in a spaced pair configuration around 50 inches from the snare drum. We're going to be looking at dynamic microphones, we're going to be looking at small diaphragm condensers, we're going to be looking at large diaphragm condensers, and finally we're going to be looking at a ribbon microphone. So the drums that I'm using today to record are a DW Maple Collector Series drum set. I have a 10-inch, a 12-inch, 14-inch, 16-inch toms. The kick is a 22 by 18, and the snare is a 14 by 5.5. Everything is going into 2 different UA4710D preamps, and that is going into an Apollo 16. Okay, so for each microphone, first we're going to be listening to all the microphones in a row, just the overheads with all the close mics. I have toms, I have 4 tom mics, I have a kick, and I have a snare. And usually I would use a lot more microphones than that to mic a drum set, but just for simplicity, we're just going to be using those microphones. So first we're going to be listening to that, and then we're going to be listening to everything with processing, with equalization, compression, reverb, and for everything I'm going to be using stock Pro Tools plugins. So the first microphone that we're going to be looking at is an SM-57. So this is probably one of the most, alongside with the SM-58, and they both share the exact same microphone capsule. So alongside with the SM-58, this is probably one of the most famous microphones of all time. You can really use it on anything, but on the drum set, it is most typically used on the snare, either as a snare top or a snare bottom. It's a dynamic microphone, so it's typically used as a close mic. You can use it as a room mic. I actually never have, and I've definitely never used it as an overhead, so I'm actually really excited to see what this one's gonna sound like. Okay, so I gotta say that I'm actually pretty surprised at how much this is working as an overhead. It definitely doesn't have the cymbal definition that I look for in overheads, and it's definitely a little mid-range heavy than what I would typically use. That's definitely something you can fix with equalization, but I definitely find with SM-57s that they tend to get a little brittle when you're really boosting the top end. Okay, so let's listen to it with all the close mics in there. I don't know, it honestly sounds pretty good with all the close mics in. I mean, still the same thing with the cymbal definition, but the kick is coming through. The toms are actually really coming through, probably because of all the mid-range in there, and the snare actually sounds pretty good. Still not as detailed as I'd like for an overhead, but all in all, I'm pretty surprised at this one. So the SM-57 is around $100. You can typically find them for cheaper for used, and you have no problem getting one of these used because they're literally indestructible. Okay, so the next microphone that we're going to be looking at is the Sennheiser MD-421. Now, on a drum set, this is most typically used as a tom mic. Some people use it as a kick mic. I've used it as a kick in. On other stuff, some people use it as for saxes. I think even like Jerry Garcia would use it as vocals. I think a couple other guys would use it as vocals. All in all, it's a really, really solid microphone. It clocks in at around $350 new. You can usually find them hovering around $250 to $275, but sometimes you can even find them for $175 used. But that is a little bit pricey for a dynamic microphone. The only thing that I would have to say about this microphone that you have to watch out for is the tom clip on it is really, really, really easy to accidentally hit. And as they age, as they get older, especially the old ones, the vintage ones are horrible, but the new ones are actually not that bad. People are always complaining about the microphone clip on this one, but I find the new ones are pretty good, and you can always just like gaffer tape it on there. But that is one thing to look for. You can accidentally drop this microphone, and as using it as an overhead, that was something that I was worried about a little bit. Okay, so this one is a little bit weird. I was really excited to use this one because I personally never used any dynamic microphone as an overhead, but especially not this one. Although I have seen it used in old 60s and 70s live concerts, usually as like a mono drum overhead. So I don't know, I was interested, but I'm finding even more than the SM-57 that it is just way too high in the mids and really in the mid lows too. Yeah, it's just really not really working here. It's pretty weird as an overhead. Let's listen to it with the close mics in there. I mean, I have to say that it's not horrible as an overhead mic, especially with the close mics in. The toms sound really good, and the kick actually sounds pretty good. Snare sounds good. I would like a little more snap from it in the overheads. I'm always a firm believer that you should really get most of the snare tone from the actual overheads and not from the snare close mic, because I don't know. I never really think that snare close mics sound that good when they're just like really, really high in the mix. Kind of makes, I don't know, it just doesn't sound that great to me. So yeah, I mean, it's actually not horrible, and it does give a little bit of like a ribbon vibe, which makes sense because ribbon mics actually are dynamic microphones. So it does give you kind of that natural low pass filter, probably at around like 15K. I haven't actually looked at the frequency response for this in like a really long time, but I would be really surprised if it went all the way to 20. It's probably somewhere around like 15 or something like that. So the next microphone that we're going to be looking at is another one from Shure. It's the SM-81. This one is really, really popular, especially in live concerts as drum overheads. I also see it a lot of times on acoustic guitar, and it's really, really popular on hi-hats too. This is a small diaphragm condenser microphone, and that's going to mean that it's going to need phantom power, which you'll usually find on your interface or on your preamp. So yeah, I'm a little conflicted when it comes to this mic, just because even though it's a good mic, it's definitely not a bad mic by any stretch of the imagination. It's just for any application that you would use for it on a drum set, I would rather use a better small diaphragm condenser mic for it. It's detailed, but it tends to be a little bit grainy on the high end, which is definitely not what I'm looking for from an SDC. But yeah, let's listen to it. So yeah, picking up a lot of cymbals, and that's very, very common for a small diaphragm condenser. I almost always kind of just think of them as cymbal microphones, really, when you're using them as overheads. I mean, you're gonna get the drums naturally, but it's gonna be picking up so much more of the high end that it really is just gonna sound more like cymbal mics. Not really picking up a lot of the kick, but I mean, that's understandable with a small diaphragm condenser. I actually really like the snap on the snare, and the toms are actually not bad. The body coming out of the toms is definitely really like punchy. So let's listen to it with all the mics in there. So yeah, as I was saying before, it's definitely not a bad microphone. You can really tell when I'm playing on the bell of the ride cymbal that it's just missing a little bit of that detail and the high end that I'm looking for in a small diaphragm condenser. Although I will say that with small diaphragm condensers, I do love how because there's not a lot of like body and warmth coming from the drums, you can really get it with the close mics, and you won't run into a lot of frequency problems that you may run into with large diaphragm condensers or ribbons or tube microphones for that matter. So that is a cool thing about small diaphragm condenser microphones. So the SM-81s are around $350. You can sometimes find them like $200. So the SM-81s are around $350 new. You can usually find them around $250 used, which I think is exactly what I got my other pair used. So I got one pair new, one pair used. They're not a matched pair of microphones, and there is a rather noticeable difference between the two microphones that I have. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Okay, so the next microphone that we're going to be looking at are the Earthworks SR78s. These are actually a discontinued model. I think they're exactly the same as, I believe it's the SR25s. These are a cardioid, small diaphragm condenser microphone. So they're very comparable with the SM-81s. And I can't get them out. Come on. There we go. Yeah, so these microphones are fantastic. I mean, first of all, they look really cool. They got like a really cool, like futuristic look to them. But they sound amazing. They just sound amazing. So I've been using these in place of the SM-81s for basically anything I would use a small diaphragm condenser for. They have an insane frequency response. I think it's like 30 hertz to 30 kHz. And they're just crystal clear. So let's listen to them as the overheads. So yeah, I mean, they sound amazing. When I do use these, I typically use two of them in either an XY or a space pair configuration, and I'll use like a mono overhead or room mics that have like a little warmth and body to add in there, because they don't sound brittle, but they definitely don't have any like warmth that you would get from a large diaphragm condenser, a ribbon, or a tube mic. But I just love how like unbelievably clear they are, and you can really hear what I was talking about with the SM-81s when I'm playing on the bell of the cymbal. They're just so crystal clear. You can hear every single note, and that's what I'm really looking for, and that's what most people are looking for in a small diaphragm condenser mic. So I could not recommend these more. So yeah, I think it's like either the SR30 or the SR25. It's around $1,400 for a new pair matched. I actually found these on Reverb used for $800 for the pair, which is crazy. I absolutely could not pass on that. Cool, so let's listen to them with all the close mics in there. So again, it sounds amazing. I have nothing but good things to say about these microphones. I really love with small diaphragm condensers how easily the toms and the kick and the snare as close mics will blend in with it, because so little of the tone of the kick and the toms are coming through from the overheads. you can really like place those, and you can really like aggressively EQ those parts of the drum set without a fear of things sounding weird and phasey, because they're coming through so apparently in the overheads. Alright, so the next microphone that we are going to be listening to is the Behringer B1. And so this is actually the first condenser mic that I ever got. It is a very cheap large diaphragm condenser microphone. I think it's around $100. It may be like $119, but I think it's around $100. And I have to say, for the price, it's actually not bad. It's not a bad microphone. There is one thing, however, about it that is really bad, and that is the shock mount that comes with it. Okay, so this shock mount is absolutely atrocious. It's the worst shock mount that I've ever seen in my entire life. It is extremely frustrating, and I really can't stress this enough, because it actually took me like 45 minutes to set these microphones up, and at the end I still couldn't get them to work. Or I couldn't get the shock mount to work. I really, in the end, the microphone was just kind of like laying here, and then like it was still like touching part of the stand. So it honestly didn't even really work as a shock mount, because in case you didn't know, the actual point of a shock mount is to keep the mic suspended in the air so that you don't have vibration like from the floor, which is a very real thing when you're using a kick drum and you have toms with legs and stuff. So when we listened to, I noticed that when I was editing this, that there is a lot of bass in these microphones, and that really could be because of the shock mount. But I have to say, I really tried. Like, I tried for like 45 minutes, and after a while, I just had to move on. So I'm not rating any of these microphones, but if I was, that would definitely knock some stars off for this one. All right, so let's listen to it. So I gotta say, this is another one that I'm like super surprised at. I mean, these are not expensive microphones. These are super cheap. These are like dirt cheap mics, and they sound pretty good, honestly. I mean, there's some things it's a little bit brittle on the top end, but it's got some good clarity. I mean, it has better detail than the SM-81s on the top end. So yeah, I gotta say, I'm like super surprised. This is actually a super good, really, really good bargain. So let's listen to it with all the close mics in. All right, so now we're gonna be looking at my favorite pair of overheads that like I own. These are the C414 Xls. I have a matched pair of them. So these are definitely the most pricey out of any of the mics that we've seen so far. New, these are gonna run you around like $2,300, which is a lot. I think I got these used for like $1,600 or something like that. And these are very, very, very well-made microphones. These are probably the most versatile out of all of the microphones that we've seen so far, or that we're going to see today, period. Some of the things that I really like about these mics is they have a lot of features on them. They have a dB, they have a pad on them, so they have -6 dB, -12, -18 dB pad that you can cycle through. They also have a high-pass filter that goes all the way up to 160 hertz. It goes to 0, 40, 80, 160 hertz. And they also have a ton of different polar patterns on them. So they have omni, they have cardioid, they have supercardioid, they have hypercardioid, and they have figure 8. And they also have all the ones like in between. So like in between omni, in between omni and cardioid, in between cardioid and supercardioid, and onward and onward. So there's a lot of things that you can do with this microphone. It's fantastic. Really, really, really good on overheads. Really good on toms too. Sounds fantastic for toms. I've seen people use them for the bottoms of snares. I've used them for room mics a lot. Probably one of my favorite room mics. So there's two main different ones that you'll look at. There's the XLSs and there's the XL2s. The XL2s have a capsule that's based on the C12, the AKG C12. It's really, really famous tube microphone, and it's a little more colored. And what I mean by that is I just mean that the frequency response of it is like more like tailored, you know. The XLS is a lot more flat. It's very neutral, and I actually prefer that in my overheads. I like it to be really flat. That way that if I want to add the color, I can add the color with an EQ. You know, that's how I feel at least. All right, so let's listen to these. So again, these microphones sound awesome. With all the close mics in, they sound really good. And so we are starting to really hear a lot of the sympathetic vibration from the toms. When we put a gate, when I put a gate and when I EQ that, it's going to be a lot less apparent, especially since this room is sound treated. So I do have that in my favor, and I do tune my toms in a way where it's not too apparent. And that's something that you should always think about when you're recording in a small room. You know, record and sound check. Do a couple of takes and just listen to the room, especially when it comes to the toms, because I don't know, I can't tell you the amount of times that toms have potentially ruined a take. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so the last microphone that we're going to be looking at is the Kohl's 4038 ribbon microphone. This microphone was originally designed and patented by the BBC, and it was supposed to originally be a broadcasting microphone, which is really interesting when you think about it, because ribbon microphones are very easily damaged by wind and moisture, which are all things that human voices produce. So it's always been interesting to me that this was originally designed as a broadcasting microphone, because I probably would never use it for a voice. But I don't know. You know, I know that people have gotten really good results using this on voices. So you can pick these up. This is the most expensive microphone that we're going to look at. So you can get these for around $1,400 for a single one, and they're around $2,700 for a pair. So they're definitely not cheap. So yeah, so this is really, it's used a lot of times now as room mics. Some people still use them as overheads. There are a lot of classic recordings that have these as drum overheads. Lots of Zeppelin records, lots of Beatles, some Pink Floyd. I think a lot of the tracks on Dark Side of the Moon were actually tracked with these as overheads. And you can really hear that like vintage warmth and vibe when you listen to these. Okay, so let's check these out. You're actually going to probably notice how similar this is to the SM-57. It obviously sounds a lot better, and it has a better frequency response, and it's not as heavy in the mids, but it still has that that sound, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because a ribbon mic, as I said before, is a type of dynamic microphone. So one thing to keep in mind with this microphone in particular, but a lot of microphones, but this one in particular does not sound good on its own. This microphone needs EQ. Okay, and one of the greatest things about this microphone is you can really push the top end like really far, really crank the dB on the top end, and it's not going to sound brittle. It's actually going to sound really nice and warm, which is one of my favorite things about this mic. But if you just listen to it with no EQ, it actually doesn't sound that fantastic. So that's one thing to keep in mind with this microphone. Okay, so let's listen to it with the close mics. So one thing I will say though, even without the EQ, I really love how the drums themselves sound on here. The cymbals sound like pretty good. They could use a little more top end, a little more like 15, 20K, a little more air. But man, the drums, the toms, the kick, the snare sounds fantastic. Has all that vintage vibe to it. All right, so next we're going to be looking at each microphone again with some sound processing on it. Okay, so I put a little bit of EQ, compression, and reverb for each of them. So I decided to only spend around 15 to 20 minutes mixing with each of these microphones, just because honestly you could spend hours and hours and hours in the mixing process. And I also, as I said before, decided to only use stock Pro Tools plugins. All right, cool. So let's listen to each one of them, and I'm not going to do too much commentary. right, thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe. It really just helps the channel grow. And if you have any ideas on any lessons or video ideas that you'd like to see me do in the future, please do let me know in the comments. All right, thank you so much.